Audience participation. This is why we come to events. I don't know. Sorry, I'm exhausted. My name is Ken Chen. How are you all doing tonight? Thank you. I'm a writer, and I'm here to moderate these three fantastic writers. I'll say a few boring things, and then they will say enlightening, amazing, brilliant things. So we're going to hear for Ingrid Rojas Contreras, Sophia Sinclair, and Philip Lopate. Let's give them all a hand. Before we start, I want to thank the Brooklyn Book Festival for organizing this. And I want to thank the Brooklyn Public Library. How many of you have a library card at the Brooklyn Public Library? Wow, like everyone. Okay, donate to them, and also go to their website where they have lots of fantastic free events like this one, Brooklyn Public Library Presents. And also, I wanted to thank all of you for lasting the grueling marathon that is the Brooklyn Book Festival and still being here at 5 p.m. Okay, so they're each gonna do very abbreviated readings. Then we will have our Oprah book club section where Oprah is unfortunately replaced by me. And then you will have the point to ask questions and answers. But first, we'll do readings. So first, I'm delighted to introduce Ingrid Rojas Contreras, the author of the magnificent The Man Who Could Move Clouds, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer, the National Book Award, and the National Book Critics Circle. And not only that, but Ingrid was recently involved in a movement to open the Pulitzer to undocumented writers. The Man Who Could Move Clouds is a book that feels like it was written by a mirror. A mirror is a device of reflection, which is the mode of the memoir. It is also the vehicle of signification, the way a mother can duplicate a daughter, the way sympathetic magic can cause an effect on something else. And it is also the tool of metaphor. This is a book about the void, the lack that is the deceased, the colonial past, repression, and the lack that is an amnesia that both she and her mother suffered years apart. The book is about curanderos, those who can generate ghost clones of themselves, speak to ghosts, and move clouds with their minds, like her grandfather Nono and her mother Mommy. Like Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior, this is a memoir that operates between truth and fiction and shows how those categories might not be opposites. It is a book between a mother and a daughter, between what can be spoken and what is the unconscious. It is a book that is about the memoir, but pushed to such limits of memory that the memoir becomes science fiction. Magic as a way to will against colonial ways of understanding the world. Let's give Ingrid a hand.
Thank you. That was beautiful. Thank you. I'm going to read from the first page. They say the accident that left me with temporary amnesia is my inheritance. No house or piece of land or chest of letters, just a few weeks of oblivion. Mummy had temporary amnesia as well, except where she was 8 years old, I was 23. Where she fell down an empty well, I crashed my bicycle into an opening car door. Where she nearly bled to death in Ocaña, Colombia, in darkness, 30 feet below the earth, I got to my feet seemingly unharmed and wandered around Chicago on a sunny winter afternoon. Where she didn't know who she was for 8 months, I couldn't remember who I was for 8 weeks. They say the amnesias were door to gifts we were supposed to have, which Mami's father Nono neglected to pass. Nono was a curandero. His gifts were instructions for talking to the dead, telling the future, healing the ill, and moving the clouds. Thank you. Oh, sure. I thought we were doing shorter, but I guess I will do more. We were a brown people, mestizo. European men had arrived on the continent and violated indigenous women, and that was our origin, neither native nor Spanish, but a wound. We called the gifts secrets. In the mountains of Santander, the fathers had passed the secrets to the sons, who passed the secrets to the sons, who passed the secrets to the sons. But none of his sons, Nono said, had the testículos required to be a real curandero. Only Mami, strong-willed, unafraid, more of a man than most men in his eyes, whom he liked to call mi animal de monte, could have housed the gifts. But Mami was a woman, and such things were forbidden. If a woman came to possess the secrets, it was said that misfortune would soon follow. Yet as 8-year-old Mami recovered from her injuries after falling down the well, and as her memories returned, it so happened that from wherever her mind had gone, she brought back the ability to see ghosts and hear disembodied voices. The family says Mami was destined for the secrets, and since Nono couldn't teach them to her, the secrets had come directly to her. 4 decades later, when I suffered my accident and lost my memory, the family was thrilled. Tias poured drinks, told one another with an air of festivity, "There it goes again, the snake biting its own tail." And then they waited to see how exactly the secrets would manifest in me. Thank you.
So, Sophia's book, How to Save Babylon, is coming out right now. And it has one thing I've never seen in a hardcover book, which is if you look at the inner leaf, there's this poem, Silver, beautifully printed. And it begins with the line, "Silver flows through my veins, the words I bleed are silver." And this line gives a sense of the power of this book, the way that blood can serve as silver, the way that wounds can serve as a form of sublimation. If you've read her poetry book, Cannibal, then you might have been struck by the way her sensuosity, her language, seems to surround a negative space. This book almost feels like the opposite. We finally know what was unspoken, what was that wound that could not be described. This incredibly moving, propulsive memoir describes a childhood living under an oppressive, patriarchal, Rastafarian family in Jamaica in deeply impoverished circumstances. This is a feminist story of escaping male oppression through the power of poetry. And this will sound very cheesy, but as a poet who sometimes is an apostate of poetry myself, this is a book that will make you believe in poetry. And I actually wrote that down 3 times, which means I thought I had a lot more to say. But it is an incredibly moving, rich, propulsive book, novelistic, and filled with incredible texture of imagination that goes beyond memory into something like poetry in the novel. Let's give a hand to Sophia.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ken. Thank you all for being here. Happy to be here also with Ingrid and Philip. Thank you. Can you all hear me? Mommy, can you hear me? Okay. So I'm going to read a short, just like a short paragraph from the book. But I just want to clarify that the poem that's in the end pages in the book, I wrote when I was 16. So be easy on it when you read it. 16. But it's important.
It's important in the narrative.
Yeah. Okay, so as Ken said, I grew up in this very strict Rastafari household. And by the time I was 9 years old, I began to question these patriarchal rules, why they were different me than they were for my brother. You know, my sisters, my mother and I, we had like these rules on what we could wear. We had to cover our arms and our legs. We had to cover our hair. We could not wear jewelry or makeup. Our bodies were supposed to be pure. They were supposed to be the temple of Jah, which is the Godhead figure of Rastafari. And so this passage I'm reading I'm beginning to question at 9 what this is all about and whether this was the path for me. I came to realize that what my father wanted on his return from Japan was the perfect daughter. And when a Rasta man said daughter, he meant both his wife and his child, as my father called my mother his daughter when speaking to his Rasta brethren, who also called their partners their daughters. For the men of Rastafari, the perfect daughter was everything a woman was supposed to be. The perfect daughter was whittled from Jah's mighty oak, cultivating her holy silence. She spoke only when spoken to. The perfect daughter was humble and had no care for vanity. She had no needs, yet nursed the needs of others, breastfeeding an army of Jah's mighty warriors. The perfect daughter sat under the apple shade and waited to be called, her mind empty and emptying. She followed no God but her father until he was replaced with her husband. The perfect daughter was nothing but a vessel for the man's seed, unblemished clay waiting for Jah's fingerprint. You're old enough now to help out in the kitchen, my father told me one day, making quick work of whittling me. That I need to learn from your mother. Watch how she carries herself. I watched my mother and found in her long silences something potent waiting to be said, like the anxious moment before thunder. But no matter how much I longed for it, she never thundered. She never spoke her mind or disagreed with my father. She smoked and breastfed my sister Shari. She smoked and spared me from the tedium of kitchen work. And she smoked and woke up before dawn to cook all our meals and hand wash all our clothes, folding them away afterward, like her thoughts, in the back of the chest of drawers, untouched. She was the perfect daughter. Perhaps it was true what my father said, that I lacked discipline, the way any 9-year-old lacks discipline. I didn't always listen. I was skeptical. I was curious. I touched the flame simply because it was burning. Because discipline always seemed to me the pin that held the butterfly in its display case. Work maketh the man. Day after day, I swung over those words and saw ahead of me a life withering slowly under his multiplying decrees. Day after day, my heart bucked up against it. I was never going to be the perfect daughter. A grin of mischief opened ever so slightly inside of me. A seedling of a voice that said, no. Thank you. I just want to contextualize that my mother is now no longer silent. So good for that.
I was saying earlier, I'm a little starstruck by Sophia's mother being here because it's like the main character of an amazing novel walking off the pages, and you're like, and being like, hey, what's up? I'm also glad to celebrate Philip Lopate's A Year and a Day. If, like me and many of you being New Yorkers, have spent a lot of your time being in the cultural fabric of New York by hearing Philip on the radio or reading his reviews or seeing him about town, this book is an experiment in that it's a collection of blog entries that he wrote over a year. And I was recently at a party where I met a young writer who was recounting a conversation she had with someone else where she said, this person wasn't even familiar with the early days of blogging in the 2015, 2020 period. And I never have felt more old in my life, which made me think that the blog, in a way, like cinema, which is one of Philip's great loves, are, I feel like, two symbols of modernity that are already antiquated. So what I think is so interesting about Philip's take on the blog form is that on the one hand, the book is breezily elegant. It's more occasional and impersonal than diary, but more porous and more personal than a critical essay. The book is very addictive. It reads more like a collection of belles-lettres, but in this form, Philip can interrogate what is the form of the essay? What can we learn from people like Emerson and, I think, your great love, Montaigne? We read his thoughts on Kiarostami, visiting Shanghai, urban planning, Gong Li, Catherine Deneuve, his students, his wife, and much, much more. I felt like secretly this was an inadvertent memoir, a book about eros, whether romantically through friendship or the intellectual eros that makes up this entire event. Let's give a hand to Philip.
Thank you. Neither inadvertent nor advertent. I've never written a memoir, and maybe we can get into the reasons for that after this reading. I wrote about a lot of different subjects, and one of them was on the death of friendship. and I'm going to read the opening of that. There are few things as mystifying and unnerving to me as the demise of a friendship. I find myself brooding about the few friendships of mine that have cooled and wondering what went wrong. Was there something I did to offend? Some incident I can no longer remember? That would be the best case. Usually they dwindled away without specific provocation. We assume that love affairs are transitory, dependent as they are on the novelty of erotic excitement that habituates in time. But since friendship cools on a milder, steadier flame, it would seem that, barring some unexpected quarrel, one should be able to stay friends for life. The mistake here is in underestimating the romantic side of friendship, which can exceed that aspect in love affairs. Without the benefit of carnal release, there is no ceiling to idealization of the other or projections of spiritual attachment. The friend can seem like your psychic twin, the one you can tell everything to. This mirroring fantasy, essentially narcissistic, may shatter upon the discovery that the other person is indeed a separate individual with certain peeves that include you, or monomanias that annoy you, or periods of monastic withdrawal into self-absorption, or simply ambitions to travel in a higher social circle than the one you inhabit.
Thank you, Philip. So, one thing I was thinking about in my many attempts to devise ways of connecting all of your books is the way that writing a memoir or even writing a blog post, it's obviously very different from writing a poem or writing in your diary. And one way is that you're writing about other people and you're transforming your family members or your friends into characters. And they become characters in different ways. They can be very thick characters or flat or round, people who appear in scene. So in both of your books, your family members become these very vibrant characters in very rich and complicated ways. There's the classic question that every young writer has, which is, can I say something mean about my mom or dad? There's a little bit of that question. But you're often, for example, imagining moments where you were not there, but you're depicting it in scene. You're deciding how do you depict your grandfather, your mother, your sibling in as a novelistic character. And in your case, your mother and father are particularly charged. Your siblings are going through the same thing, and there's very complex relationships. So I'm wondering what you were thinking about in the process of turning them into characters. And how did they react? And Philip, I feel like the passage you read was so perfect because one current in your book is, it seems like a meditation on the nature of friendship, which, as you say, is different than romance. But your wife pops up a lot, and I'm curious about how you thought about depicting her, how she felt about being depicted. And when you talk about your friends, there is this element where you talk about the erotics of friendship. And is there some element of homoerotic attraction there, which I thought was so interesting.
Definitely.
But I'd love to hear all of your thoughts on this.
I can start. I think when I was writing about family, one of the things that I think about is not just, beyond like the person and what happened, I start to think about their role and what are the orbits of, relationships that go out and make meaning. And so, for my mother, she was a curandera and she had like a business running out of our house. And she grew up with my grandfather doing the same, but in a village. And I watched her receive so many people from the capital in Bogota who would come to her with very specific crises, and she would be the person who is mediating that crisis. And so to me, that was really interesting. And then I, think about her and, her as a character and like the complexities and the contradictions that live within her. And, same goes with my dad and, this idea of, abuse and like how do you kind of portray abuse if it's abuse in your family. And yeah, I always kind of think beyond, like it's important because, we often keep so much silence around abuse because we want to be polite. And it's so important to break silence when that silence is protecting abuse. So I thought about, I weighed all of those things together as I was crafting them on the page and trying to think about not just what they mean in my life, but what they mean in the world.
I don't know if I thought this through when I brought my mom because now I'm like, I have to like talk about it, but not look at her. Okay. I really wanted to have the book read like a tribute to the love I have for my siblings and for my mother and for my family. And so, similarly to what Ingrid said, not just like this is what happened and here are the facts, but I wanted how I described everybody to hold some weight, that the reader would feel skin close, that they would kind of feel, like you say, like these people, like you would feel the warmth of my mother's hands, you would kind of hear her laughter, that you would,
There's a lot of love in your writing, I feel like.
Thank you. So that was important to me. But then there were some early chapters where I really wanted to get into the memories of my parents themselves. And so I sat them down and I asked, I interviewed them extensively about their own childhood and their own adolescence so I could kind of craft that chapter about how they came to choose Rastafari when they were teenagers. And so that was really interesting to me because for the first time I had to hear my parents kind of contextualize their own adolescence in a way that I'd never thought about it before. And so in the writing of the book, I came to know them in this new way, and then having to kind of sit inside their head as I'm writing the chapter really showed me, like I had to see them in a different light, and a new love bloomed from writing them that way. Yeah.
So I just want to clarify that in the past, I've written many times about my family. And at one point, my mother said, that's it. You don't have the right to, I don't want you to ever to write about me again. And I said, but Mom, I can do you, Like, you come alive on the page. I'm not going to say that. But she said, well, I'll go to your book party, but I'm going to tell the people that you are my nephew, not my son. And she also said, why do you keep writing about that period? I said, you mean my childhood? In the new book, my wife said, it was very simple. My wife said, you may not write about me, period. And of course I did. So, and my daughter was a little bit the same way, but they both said, they were both terrified when this book came out because I hadn't let them read it in advance. I thought, this is my book, and I want to have my say. So eventually they did read it. They said, well, it's not so bad, They saw there was a lot of love in it. I just would like to clarify something, why I've never written a memoir. I guess if you were to add up all my personal essays, there would be a kind of memoir in spite of itself. But a writer I know, Emily Fox Gordon, said one problem with the memoir is that it moves toward a redemptive or transcendent kind of conclusion, no matter how screwed up the situation is, just the fact that this person wrote this book and survived is a kind of a triumph, a triumphalist, you might say, bias in the memoir. And me, I've always been very leery of transcendence and redemption, so I opted for the shorter form, the essay, which is more about, for me, it's more about daily life than it is about transcendence.
I was debating if we should brawl over the nature of the memoir, but maybe that's not a good idea. But I'm curious. So you wrote about your wife when she said no.
Yes.
And you interviewed your parents, which I think is so interesting, given especially your father, who's in some ways the villain.
No, don't say that.
But I was so impressed by how empathetic you are to your father, and how things change in the end. So I don't mean that in a flattening way.
No, I know what you mean. Yeah. But you know, when I first started thinking about writing it, like maybe 11 years ago, and I felt that the book I would have written then and the way I would have written it is a completely different book. Like it was a book that wouldn't have been as nuanced and forgiving.
More adversarial.
Yeah. Because I would have been still writing out of wounds that were very fresh, and that I hadn't had enough distance. And it was through doing these interviews and having to really sit in my father's head and his thinking and thinking about his own childhood and his own childhood traumas, things that he never told me before, seeing him get emotional about talking about his own childhood. You know, his mother abandoned him because he became a Rastafari. And so when you described that scene to me, I was so moved in a way that I'd never had been before, because he loomed so large in our house as, like, you know, the authoritarian figure my whole life, that I'd never had a chance to humanize him, or he'd never humanized himself to us. But in writing the book, I had to, you know, and it was important to me that I did, that I did you know, that I was able to portray everybody in all their complexities, good and bad. Yeah, so that was only possible after a lot of time, distance, processing, to be able to write that way. And in writing the book, I actually became a forgiving person, which I would have never described myself as before. But in writing the book, I kind of found it as an act of forgiveness, that the book itself might be a currency for healing. Yeah.
Philip or Ingrid, I wonder, when you were writing about your mother, she is this larger-than-life Marquez anti-hero almost, you know, like this charismatic, almost, I hope this is not a bad thing to say, like Bugs Bunny always tripping up the evil Elmer Fudd's of the Colombian FARC versus state terrible world. Sorry, this metaphor kind of ran away from me. But did your mother read it? I feel like she shifts in terms of her density. There are moments where she's more mythic and moments where she's more like quotidian mother. And Philip, in your case, you know, in addition to writing about your wife, you write about your daughter and your friends and doctors that you've had. You know, the person letting you into the waiting room. So have people commented on how they're portrayed? Especially because I feel like because a blog is a quotidian form, there is this way where you can see yourself next week and then wonder if you're going to be in the next installment the following week, you know?
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, they say that, you know, if you go to sleep with dogs, you wake up with fleas, you know? And it's a little bit like if you hang out with writers, you know? You're going to be written about. Get used to it. I mean, a lot of writers try to deal with the guilt that they have, you know, in different ways. Like they'll show the manuscript to their friend, you know, or their parents, you know. I don't want to give the subject I'm writing about that power over me, you know, so I don't show it to them in advance. I mean, my approach is just to accept the guilt, you know, like, okay. To a certain
This
extent,
is really profound, actually.
Yeah. I'm a rotten individual. You know, I'm going to hurt people sometimes. You know, they're going to hurt me too. So let them write their book.
That sounds like the same conscientious process that you went through.
Yeah. Well, I'm lucky because my mother doesn't like reading, so she's never read anything that I've written. And what she'll say is, "Oh, if they turn it into a movie, I'll watch it, though." But what we do is that I usually tell her as I'm writing. I usually tell her what I'm thinking about. So I'll say, you know, you told me this story and and I'll just tell it back to her and to say like, this is what I got from what you told me. And I'll tell her like, I interpret it this way, or I'm thinking about this connection and how you are. And then sometimes she will disagree with me. And I put that all back into the writing. So when I'm trying to write her character, I think about those moments where she is kind of behaving very mythically. Like, you know, people are coming to our home and she's like praying over water and giving that water to them and saying like, this is gonna, you know, heal your broken heart. And, you know, people are, you know, coming back for that. And then she can't, you know, she doesn't know how to like make rice, for example. And so thinking about her and, you know, in those ways, and there's just so much humor to her too. But in writing it down, I put both, you know, what I interpret as a truth, and then the little things that she says to argue with me. You know, she'll say like, "Oh, I don't," you know, she says like, "I don't believe that happened that way," or that isn't how I felt. So I don't interpret those comments as I'm supposed to correct what I write down, but I interpret it as I'm gonna, you know, write the kind of the truth as I see it and how I interpret it, and have a little moment where you know, I'll have like, you know, and my mother says like she doesn't think that happened, and to me that feels like a closer approximation to truth than just, you know, trying to kind of choose one and that's the one that you tell.
You mean to contest it instead of saying that there is a truth.
Like the conflict, like the disagreement with it. I think that's interesting, and that also, I think that's closer.
I wanted to ask all three of you about world building, because I feel like that's one thing that all three of you were doing, in that there are often complex things that you're trying to have the reader understand. I think sometimes when you're writing maybe out of a diaspora context, you have this entire world you need to understand. So it could be the world of your family, who are all these personalities and characters. It could be what is the political situation. So, you know, the history of the Spanish colonization, the casta system, who is FARC, what are these guerrilla movements, what is this type of shamanism? In your case, you know, not even what is Jamaica, but what are these different, you know, all the different flavors of Rastafarianism, but also just the different places you're living, the settings, the shore, the school. And Philip, I feel like your book is about the world of New York culture, and that I feel like we get a sense of what your typical day is like, where you like to hang out a little bit, what movies you're thinking about, where you go when you're not in New York. So there is this way where by focusing on the quotidian, you're painting this sense of what your cultural world is. And I feel like you must have had some sense of writing these blogs not as a series of essays where you're pitching ideas, but as being something slightly personal. And the two of you, I feel like it must have been very intentional to figure out how am I going to teach the reader something without them having to get exposition slapped across their face? How much am I going to have that's not in standard English, but have some of that in there? So I feel like that is always an interesting experience as a writer. So how were you navigating this world building?
The year that I was writing about was a year that Trump got elected. And I wrote several entries about the election, about Hillary and about Trump. And I'm always a little bit hesitant to write about politics because I want to be able to say something new, and so much has been said, you know, so much of it would come out like just the standard, you know, left-wing rant, you know. But obviously, politics impinges on my life, you know, I can't help. But I could not help but, you know, be thrown by Donald Trump, you know, as many of us were, you know. Actually, I had to tell my wife, I had to put her on a MSNBC diet because she was watching about 12 hours a day, and I said, no, you know, like that's crazy, you know. But so I had to do the same thing with myself. I had to rigorously say, I'm not going to brood about this more than 2 hours a day, you know. But those 2 hours I couldn't escape.
Well, you know, for me, going into this, there was so much about Jamaica and about Rastafari that I knew that I needed to expand the global view of what it is beyond this sort of postcard idea, someone else's idea of paradise. And also, particularly growing up Rastafari, I feel that even though it holds this really large space in the global and cultural imagination, most people don't really know, or what they think they know about Rastafari is not accurate. You know, like we're less than 1% of the Jamaican population. They're historically a persecuted minority in Jamaica. And, you know, the movement's beginning is entwined with British colonialism. And so it had to be political, right? But for me, writing is always a political act. The fact that I'm speaking to you in English is a political act. But then also writing about Jamaica, being someone that comes from the seaside, who saw the hotels being built up on either side of my village, hotels that we were forbidden from going to, was something that I also wanted to express to the reader. And like you say, in a way that wasn't just a fact dump.
Yes.
You know, as a poet, I agonized over how do I interweave the history and the political and cultural context in the narrative and still have it read beautifully and, like, you know, like enjoyable to read.
Right.
That there's poetry there. So I was trying to do all of those things at once, and I wanted the reader to also feel my love of the natural landscape of Jamaica, of my island, and everything that I love there, to feel kind of immersed in the humid kiss of Jamaica. And so I was thinking about doing all of those things at once when thinking about world building. I never thought about it as world building, but like, how do I, you know, find a mirror from the landscape, a mirror for how I construct the actual sentences on the page.
I think for me, I traveled back to Colombia, and I think I talked about history only when I had questions that I couldn't answer. And one of them was that, you know, like in my family, and many curanderos are very secretive about what they do. And so that started for me as a question, like, what is the secrecy, or where does that come from? And it, you know, it led me to the history of, you know, the Spanish Inquisition, dragging curanderos from their communities and, you know, taking them to the pyres, and people would be, you know, they would die from that. And so then that was like the moment that sort of silence was born. And in thinking about like the most interesting, you know, world building that I did in the memoir was probably there's a part where I'm talking about my mother's accident and her experience of amnesia, and my accident and my experience of amnesia. And I just remember just being constantly on the phone with my mother, asking her, like, what do you remember of this time where you didn't have a memory? And it was so complicated to write into that area, because it's an area where you're both like on the cusp of becoming and also being undone at the same time. And it was just, I mean, it was so challenging, but it was so beautiful to write into it. And I wanted to kind of write like the surreality that we, you know, each of us felt during that time, and the things that we, you know, that the parts of memory that we still had and kind of held on to, and the way that things felt very strange and looked very strange. That's probably the part of the book that I loved writing the most, because it was so challenging and so difficult, but so satisfying. And I remember I was writing that part one sentence a day, because it was just so,
Wow.
you know, I would have to think about, okay, so like in this moment, in this scene, I don't remember anything, but how do I describe the experience of being on this street? Like, how do you actually do that? And I could only do it one sentence at a time, and it would take me so long, and I would just be done for the day.
Wow.
So that part took a long time to write.
We might have time for one question, but I might ask a question in case no one... You're all introverted. That's why you're here. Okay. So all three of your books, they have one thing in common, which is that they're all about the power of culture, books, poems, narration, you know, poetry as a way to escape narration. Like, shamanism is really storytelling, you know. And, you know, your reviews are clearly all about the life of the mind. But I want to flip it and say, I feel like at the same time, all three books of yours are about dissociation. And you have your inside and your outside, what you look like, you know, like the black dress that you're getting when you fall, the dreads, how other people see you. But your inside is completely different. So Phil, in your book, there's a part where you talk about how you're good at friendship, but your wife and daughter say that you're always checked out and you're in your head. And, you know, I feel like, you know, clearly having amnesia or having this alienated inner world because of your family and your school situation. My question is, do you think that dissociation is a laboratory that makes writers? Do you think writers have to be alienated and checked out? And what was it like to write about that?
I think a certain amount of detachment, I don't know if dissociation is the word I would use, a certain amount of detachment is a good thing to have as a writer. And it may not be so good within your family, your domestic situation, but when you come to write about something, you know, you don't want to write with an axe to grind, so it's good to have some detachment, you know. And writers are strange creatures because they're always watching other people. They're like spies in a way, you know. It's not well known, but writers also envy non-writers because non-writers don't have to keep watching everything all the time. You know, Henry James said, be someone on whom nothing is lost. Well, a non-writer doesn't have to take on that obligation at all. Anyway, I do think that, I don't know if alienation is the right word, but certainly ability to stand back and to be able to look at yourself also with some distance is really important.
I guess I'll say, yeah, I think that there was something really helpful about losing my memory, and I always say that it's the happiest that I've ever been. And like the experience of not having a memory, it was just ecstasy, it was just joy, everything was constantly new to me. There was just like such a sense of curiosity. And from time to time, I still use that as a sort of writing exercise or an imagination exercise where I pretend that I am back in that state and that I don't have a memory. If I don't have, you know, the language at my fingertips, and how would I even kind of describe the speaker, for example, if the word speaker was not something that I had. And yeah, I think that there's, especially in the process of remembering myself, you know, because I had that experience of seeing a reflection of myself in a black window and not even realizing that I was looking at myself for a few seconds. There's something, yeah, very magical about kind of being stuck outside of yourself, where you get like this, you know, multi-second moment where you can really see yourself as separate, like you know, And so I love that, and I try to recreate that in myself all the time.
I love that. That like joy that comes from being unattached to memory. That's lovely. I wish I had that kind of.
Yeah. I wish that there was a way that, to give people amnesia in a very specific way where, nothing else was impaired. You didn't lose language, but it was just you.
Yeah.
So good.
Constant like joys of discovery. Yeah. For me, let's see. It wasn't like disillusionment or detachment. I think because I'm a poet, we have this like particular affliction, right? It's like once you've written your first poem or read your first poem and felt the current of the poem move through you, the damage has been done. But I always think of solitude or quiet as kind of necessary for poetry to happen. So
Yes.
maybe, there is something in that idea of, for a long time, when I was growing up, the solitude wasn't my choice, but it then became this sort of necessity, or it pushed me toward poetry being my space of survival. And so then the solitude, which came from being isolated in the Jamaican society because I was Rastafari, then became the thing that I nurtured and craved the more I grew up, because that was the space where I began to see poetry happen. I began to feel what magics could move through the words on the page. Yeah.
Do we have time for questions from the audience?
Do we have any? Can we do one question? Okay, can we do one question? Are there questions?
We've explained everything so well that there was
We've presented all of human knowledge.
I notice people being like, I have a story to tell you. Listen to this story. This story. This is the next book. So it's like, Philip, how you were saying that we're always kind of listening and kind of like, distilling the lives of other people into this potency. But now I notice.
They're saying, I'm ready for my close-up.
I'm ready for my close-up. Like, are you listening? Let me tell you the story. So I found that really interesting, that people are now coming to me as like the storyteller of the family, but they're trying to push me toward what they want me to write
Lobbying.
about. Yeah.
Lobbying.
I was thinking about how earlier you said that shamanism is storytelling. I think storytelling can also be shamanism.
Yes.
And and so of course you put a very personal story out there. People are moved by it, and they want to tell you like this is what happened in my life when I read. And I welcome those, and I love hearing those stories. My family too does that now, where they will either tell me or not tell me stories, but then other people will tell me the story that they don't want to tell me. And it becomes this network of everyone's trying to manipulate the next word.
Yeah. My aunt put in a request for who she wants to play her in the movie.
Wow.
So like it's that
Who
level.
was it? Who was it?
Halle Berry. She
Wow.
Yeah, the book I wrote before this is called A Mother's Tale, and it really was a story of my family. And my one sister loved it and bought copies for everybody. The other sister said it's all lies, and my brother never finished it. So there you go.
That sounds like the family that would drive one to become a writer.
Yes, yes.
Well, now that we've all processed our family dysfunction, so you don't have to, I want to say, Philip, is your book out yet?
What?
The new one, the NYRB book?
Yes.
Okay, so all 3 books are for sale, and these beautiful people will be here to sign them, and for you to tell them their stories, who you should be in the movie. But sorry, let's give them a hand, Ingrid, Sophia, and Philip.
I so agree with you about Sarah. I really think that